G'day everyone, Dikko here with another kick-ass walkthrough. This is part 4 of the still life series, in which we are rendering a realistic 3D still life image. And in this video, we're going to create a wine bottle shader. So you might be wondering, why are there two bottles here? Well, the one on the left is actually made in Substance Painter. The textures were created in Substance Painter, and the one on the right was made in Blender. So just to prove the fact that you can create real great shaders inside of Blender without any need for any third-party software, apart from an image editor, you can create something as good as something that you could create in Substance. So of course, this is great for those who are on a budget, who can't afford to get the software, can't afford to get access to it, and still want to create something that looks really, really cool. The other awesome thing about this method is that it works completely in both Eevee and in Cycles. So if you want to try it out in Eevee or switch over to Cycles and give it a roll, it will work. And it looks just as great, depending on your needs, of course. So let's jump right into this and get started. And of course, if you are interested, you can download the source files from my Patreon page. All you gotta do is subscribe and you'll get access to any of the working files I supply, including this bottle shader, including this material. You can download it, use it for whatever you like, or just use it to learn with. So it's completely up to you, and I would appreciate it if you give your support at the same time. And of course, if you just enjoyed this video, feel free to give a like, subscribe, and do all that other crap if you want to. Okay, so I'm not gonna go through the process of making the Substance file, but let's get started on that Blender shader. So with a standard principled shader, we're just gonna add a green material to start off with, and you can pump up the transmission and you've got glass. That's how it works, pretty simple. Give it a darker texture or darker color if you need to. And if you really just need a flat shader like that, that's pretty much it. But for now, we're just gonna go straight to a black material. We're gonna turn off transmissive for the time being, because we're gonna work on figuring out how to make the roughness map for our bottle. So I have varying levels of roughness on that material. So I added a noise texture, and I'm just ramping that down with a color ramp. And you can see that the bottle is looking a little bit stretched in the texture there. That's because we need to map it to a texture mapping node or texture coordinate node. And we're gonna link that up with UV output. So into that texture mapping node from the UV, and now we have this variation in the texture. You've got to make sure, of course, that your bottle has been UV unwrapped or UV mapped, so make sure you've done that. Otherwise, you should be good to go. All right, so now we've got that set up, we can tweak these little settings on the noise shader or noise node to your liking. I'm just going to try and add a little bit more detail and a little bit more roughness to that to give it the texture that I want. And I'm just previewing that texture with control clicking on the node, and then back to the main shader. You can see that we got a little bit of variation in the roughness on that bottle, just to give it a bit more character and a little bit more, I guess you can say, texture. And just tweaking with those little settings there, we got our first step done for the roughness. All right, moving on to the bump map, we're going to follow the exact same method, but with a few tweaks to that noise texture. I'm going to bring down the roughness to make it fairly smooth. I'm going to increase that scale, and then we're going to add a bump node and connect that up to the normal input on the shader. Make sure that the output on the noise texture is going into the height, and that the strength of that bump is really low. We want to keep it really low, and then just hook it up to your normal map, and there we have it. We have a bit of variation in that glass, makes it feel a lot more natural, a lot more realistic in that sense. So now we're going to work on the dust for the bottle. So the dust that sits on top of the bottle, we're going to create a new texture inside the node editor. Just set it to 2048 by 2048. Alpha map, you want to have an alpha of 0 on this one. You want to make sure that it's blank, and then we're going to start to paint in that texture. And of course, making sure that you have already unwrapped that, and also just switch over to your image editor window as well, so you can actually paint directly in that if you have to. Otherwise, we're going to do it in the viewport. All right, so with that in mind, we are going to make sure that we save this image straight away, even though it's got nothing on it. Make sure you save it on your computer somewhere. Otherwise, when you close Blender, it won't save that image. It's not embedded into the software, so you need to make sure that it's saved somewhere on your computer. I like to put it inside a texture folder, so just keep it there. And then I'm just gonna go straight into texture preview mode, and we're gonna start to work on the texturing of that bottle. All right, so in order to make the dust, we need a dust texture, so just try and find one online. I just went with this one I found just randomly on the internet. We can do some tweaks to this in the future, but I'm just gonna see how it works inside of Blender without any tweaks. Just gonna use it as a texture straight out of the bat. Make sure you save it somewhere on your computer, of course. I'm gonna save it in my project, in this case, inside the assets project for this file. All right, with that done, we're going to go switch into texture painting mode. So with the bottle selected, go into texture paint mode. And you'll probably want to get out of the cycles render preview as well. Make sure that the texture that you're painting is the correct one. So in this case, we've named it as dust. So make sure it's named as such, and you've selected it. And then we're going to import the texture of the dust inside the texture input for the brush itself. So navigate to where you save that image, chuck it in there, and then we should be good to go and start painting. All right, so you may see me trying to paint here and nothing's happening. And that's because I got the render preview turned on. So just switch out of that into the basic viewport settings. And you can see here that it looks transparent because we have a transparent image and we're painting opaque stuff onto it. So that's why the bottle's semi-transparent there. All right, so we've done a bit of painting there. You can see the detail and the texture. And we're going to test this out by hooking it up to the diffuse map of our material. So we need to make sure that we have a mix node for the dust color and the color of the bottle. So making sure that we have that going on. So make one color green and one color brown or gray or whatever. And then hook that dust color map into your factor. And you can see here that's not quite the right order, so we need to flip that order around. So the top one is green, the bottom one is going to be dark brown or whatever. And it's not too visible at the moment. The reason is that the contrast isn't high enough. So you may need to add a ramp node in between your texture map and the mix node in order to bump up that contrast. So I was just double checking to see that the material was working with the alpha input. It was. So it just means that we need to go ahead and add a little bit more contrast in that image. So I add a ramp node in between. I ramp it down just to see when that dust starts to pop up. So this may be a little bit of trial and error on your part, or you can go into the texture map and just add more white value to that map in order to make that color come out really strongly. Now here, I'm actually going to make a proper brush. So in Photoshop, I just opened up the dust texture, add a little bit of a vignette around that texture so it blurs out nice and cleanly, so I can use it more consistently inside of Blender. So just save that out, bring it into Blender, and just replace that texture input in the brush settings. So going back to my brush settings here, I've swapped out the brush to the new one, and now I'm starting to paint over that dust a bit more. If you find that you're not getting the color that you want or more white values in there, switch the brush setting to screen, and then you'll start to get more of that white value come through. And if you want to have a softer gradation as well, you can always add an opacity to, or bring down the opacity on your brush to make that a little bit softer. So you can see here now with a few tweaks that the dust is showing through. I'm just going through and adding more detail here and there, but it's working. It's working, and it's looking great so far. The only issue now is that we need to hook this up to this result into different parameters of our shader, namely our roughness and our transmission. So the dust doesn't transmit like glass, and neither does it reflect like glass. So we need to actually use this same input as a mix node or a mix input to create variation in the bottle. So adding a mix node, making one section black and one section white. We then mix in the ramp from the roughness into the mix node, and now we have rough dust and glossy glass. And you can see it's working there. When we switch it down to black, you can see the variation happening there. All right, we need to do the same thing for the bump now. We can actually add a little bit of bump to this if you want to. Optional, but if you want to, you can. So same method here. In this case, we're going to grab that, that dust map again with the ramp output. I'm just rerouting it to make it a bit clearer for me to navigate. And then, similar to before, just pump in the factor from the previous bump output into the mix node, and then they mix together. And now you have variation in the bump. It's very subtle because of the low resolution or the low strength of that dust, but you can see it's working there when I pump it up a little bit. So that mixing is working. You want to still keep that strength relatively low though. All right, so now we need to actually make sure that the transmission of the dust doesn't shine through as well. So the bump is working, the roughness is working, and the color is working. Now we need to do the same thing for the transmission. So we need to make sure that the dust isn't glass, isn't acting like glass. So again, another mix node. This time that factor goes into just a straight up black and white mix. White meaning that it's transmissive, black meaning that it is non-transmissive. And now the dust is showing as it should, basically. So it's not dusty, I mean, it's not glassy, it's just dust mixed on top of the glass shader. And now with a few tweaks of that ramp, we can get a very similar result to the one we see from Substance Painter on the left there. Pretty close. And again, if you're happy with that and you don't want to add a label to that bottle, you're done. You're pretty much done at this point. Now, if you want to make the label, things start to get a little bit more complicated. So again, it's going to be more mixing of nodes, but we have to create the label first in, say, Photoshop or Krita or whatever tool you want to use. What really matters is that you get the maps right, like the design of the maps. So your roughness map, your metal maps, your color maps, and the transmission maps, you make sure that those are working correctly when you create them. So I will show you how that's done. So I'm just going to go ahead and use Affinity for this one. So I'm just making a quick label. And once I've done the color map, I will actually convert that to the other maps that we need. So we need a map for roughness, we need a map for metal, and we need a map for transmission. Here's an example of the maps you'll need. So the pictures you see on the screen right now, try and follow these kinds of patterns. So make sure that you understand the principles behind these different values. So making sure that when you are doing a metallic map, for instance, you know that white is referring to 100% metallic, black is non-metallic. When you're referring to roughness, you know that black is referring to completely glossy, whereas white is referring to completely rough. And that, of course, transmission is similar, where white equals 100% transmissive or 100% glass, and that black equals 100% non-glass, no glass at all. Okay, so making sure that you are aware of that will help you build out your texture map for your label really easily. Then once you've made those maps, it's time to bring them into Blender and start mixing them in with the rest of your node setup. Okay, switching back into Blender, we are now ready to bring in those textures. So just move the other group that you've made down a little bit in the graph editor or in the node editor. And we're going to duplicate a texture input node, and then we're going to bring in, just for now, the color map for the label. Control T to add a mapping node to that, making sure that the UV input is what is controlling the distribution of that texture. And you'll see here that we have a repeating texture here, so make sure you turn that off. And you can do that by clicking, turning the setting of repeat to extend in the actual texture node itself. So you'll see it there on the list underneath flat. or linear, flat, repeat. Switch that down to extend. Now you may see me doing this in the video. I accidentally clicked type of mapping to vector. Don't do that. Keep it as the default point. You don't need to switch it to vector. That was a mistake on my part. So just ignore what I just did there. Keep it on point, as you can see there. And now we can actually change the location of that texture through the location input. So using location to sort of distribute that texture as you need to, you can now position that texture in a way that works for you. And of course, using scale to fix any stretching that goes on as well. Just takes a little bit of trial and error, but once you're happy, it's done. You don't have to worry about it ever again. And then you can use the same mapping input or output for your other textures. So now we're gonna bring in the transmissive in this case. So bring that in, switch it over to non-color. And now we need to mix that transmissive input into our transmissive mix out the top. So go ahead and add that to the mix of your transmissive. So looking at how it works, grab that transmissive and you'll see that when you input that in, you'll see that it works out pretty well. So the white value of that transmissive is working perfectly well. So you replace the white value of that mix with the transmissive map that you made in whatever image editing software you use. Now, in order to mix the label with the green glass, we need to actually add another mix node to our color input. So we use the, and this is actually where the transmissive texture helps out again, to be honest. So you mix the color input with the texture input of your label, and then you use the transmissive map as the mix factor, because that's black and white. It's exactly what we need to mix the color of the glass with the color of the label. So put that into the factor, choose the right order for that mix, and now the label is present with the colored glass. Perfect. Now moving on to the metallic, this one's a little bit straightforward because all we need to do is hook up the metallic output into the metallic input of the shader straight up, and now the label is metallic in parts that we've designated. Fucking nice. All right, what's left is basically the roughness map for the label. So I don't want the label to be 100% glossy. I want parts to be glossy and other parts to be less glossy. So we need to bring in that roughness map as well. And I'm just quickly adjusting the distribution of that texture. It's a little bit stretched, so I'm just going through and just tweaking the values a little bit. Again, always a little bit of trial and error in this case. So if you need to, go ahead and change it whenever you like. And because we're using the same mapping node for all of our texture maps, it's affecting all of them at the same time. So we don't have to worry about adjusting each texture individually. Okay, for the roughness, again, pretty straightforward. Adding another mix node there in between our values for the texture and the procedural stuff we added at the start of this video. We bring in our roughness map. We make a duplicate of our texture map there, import the roughness map, and then hook that up to the mix factor of the roughness node tree. So there we go, chuck it into the factor, and now you can see now because of that mix factor is adjusted, we can now see some variation in that roughness between the bottle itself. The only issue now is that the bottle is way too rough. Like the bottle is now white. So we actually have to fix things up a little bit in the node setup here with regards to the glass. And right now it's looking really, really smooth. So we have to adjust the color output to be black. That looks a lot better now. And with a few other tweaks, we can try and play with the order of the gloss. So making sure that we're choosing the right order of things. That looks better. And you can see here, just by tweaking or playing with the different inputs and outputs, we get the desired results that we need. And now there we have it. The bottle is good to go. And we can always go through and adjust this stuff as well. That's the great thing about this procedural material, by the way, is that, or semi-procedural material, by the way, is that we can always adjust the different factors of each element. So the amount of dust we add to the bottle, the amount of bump we add to the glass, the way we mix the label with the rest of the bottle, all that sort of stuff can be adjusted, even the images themselves. So in this case, you can see me adjusting the roughness map a little bit to make it a little less glossy, refresh that image, and now it's sorted. And there we have it, good to go. And you can tell it's just as good as what you can create inside a Substance Painter, but it costs $0. Of course, it takes a little bit of time to understand the node setup and the kind of maps you need to create. But once you understand those fundamentals, and we've been talking about those relatively often in this series, you can get a pretty good result fairly fast just in Blender alone and with a very simple image editor. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Again, the source files are available on my Patreon page, so feel free to subscribe to that and download any of the files that I provide in my videos. And of course, I'm always appreciative of those who support the channel, so thank you for those who already have. More to come soon. In the next video, we're going to talk about how to take this final render and punch it up to 11 with proper, honest to God compositing. So color grading, a little bit of blur, all that sort of crap, some aberrations in the lens, you name it. We'll go through it in the next video. But until then, catches and have fun. Cheers.